The flight attendant didn't just spill the coffee. She looked the 13-year-old black boy straight in the eye as she tilted the cup, and then she smiled. Hot liquid splashed across Preston Hayes' chest, soaking into the pale gray suit he wore so proudly. "Oops," Harper Langston said, voice dripping with mock surprise. "Maybe save the cosplay for Halloween, sweetheart." She didn't even pretend to help, just dropped a paper napkin onto his lap like she was swatting a fly. The first-class cabin went awkwardly silent, except for one middle-aged man 2 seats back who snorted under his breath. Preston didn't flinch, didn't yell, didn't even blink. He just slowly brought one hand to the collar of his suit and brushed away the droplets. Not frantically, precisely, respectfully, like someone tending to something sacred. The gold thread monogram on the fabric shimmered faintly under the cabin light. H.H., his father's initials. What would you do if your child was humiliated in front of strangers, wearing the one thing that reminded him of the father he buried? Tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe silence can be louder than shouting. Harper turned to grab another drink for a different passenger, clearly pleased with herself. One of her earrings sparkled as she smirked over her shoulder. "I swear, first class ain't what it used to be," she muttered. More laughter, low, polite, insidious. Preston remained still, except for one movement, his left thumb pressing gently against a small silver band on his wrist. To most, it looked like a fancy smart bracelet, but only a handful of people in the world knew it was more than that. Underneath the titanium shell sat a secure biometric chip linked directly to the core operations of one of the most powerful philanthropic aviation funds in the country. He tapped twice. Code HH27, priority violation, triggered. 3 rows behind, an elderly woman wearing a teal cardigan shifted uncomfortably. She'd seen the entire thing. She whispered something to her husband, but Harper didn't look back. She was too busy laughing with the man in 2C, tall, white, maybe late 40s, who had just ordered his second scotch before noon. Preston's fingers curled around the seat's armrest. Not because of pain. He'd barely reacted to the coffee, even though it burned. No, what burned deeper was the way she looked at him. Like he didn't belong here. Like his presence was some mistake, some fluke, some glitch in the system. What she didn't know was that Preston was the system. 15 minutes earlier, Harper had walked through the first-class cabin like she was gliding down a runway. Straight back, polished smile, eyes sharp. The moment she saw Preston sitting in 2A, alone, wearing a custom-fitted suit and reading a book titled Fluid Dynamics in Flight Structures, she paused, not in admiration, in judgment. And when no adult sat next to him, no father figure, no assistant, no visible explanation, her suspicion solidified. A black teenager, alone, in first class, wearing a suit. To her, it didn't add up. And so, when the drink cart reached his row, she leaned in just a little more than necessary. "Hot or cold?" she asked. "Hot's fine," Preston had answered, polite and even. What followed wasn't clumsy. It wasn't rushed. It was precise. A tilt of the wrist, a flick of the fingers, and the cup landed exactly where she meant it to. 2A wasn't just another seat. It was the one Preston had requested, because it was the seat his father once sat in on his final flight for Sky North. The last test flight before the N-17 aircraft model was certified, the one that never made it back to the runway. His father, Henry Hayes, had built the fuselage structure design for this exact model. He died for this aircraft. And now, his son was sitting in its most prestigious seat, wearing the suit tailored for the memorial event in Seattle, where Henry would be honored posthumously by the Aeronautics Institute. Preston wasn't here for comfort. He was here to finish a flight that his father never could. In Westport, Connecticut, a soft chime echoed through a private server room within the headquarters of the Henry Hayes Aviation Trust. A single notification lit up in red. Code HH27, triggered from device ID, Preston H. Within 60 seconds, the Trust's chief operations officer was on the phone with Avery Hayes, Preston's uncle, guardian, and one of the most influential figures in the U.S. aerospace finance ecosystem. "Sir, Preston just sent an HH-27, the COO said calmly. Avery didn't need to ask why. He simply said, "Full protocol. Freeze all capital lines to Sky North. Notify FAA observers and airport liaison teams." "Understood." "Also," Avery added, voice turning cold, "start pulling Sky North's compliance logs for the last 90 days. I want to know what else they've been hiding." Back in the sky, the plane cruised smoothly over the Appalachian Range, but tension in first class was beginning to curdle. The man in 2C now leaned across Preston's armrest, whispering with amusement, "Bet that suit costs more than your family's rent, huh?" Preston looked at him once, just once. That same stillness, that same silence. But this time, the entire front row felt it. The kind of silence that doesn't apologize, the kind that waits. From the outside, Preston Hayes didn't look like power. He looked like a smart, well-mannered kid. But inside that quiet expression was $3.8 billion of influence, pulsing behind encrypted networks, investment codes, and executive-level clearance. And in 10 minutes, everything Harper thought she knew about this job, this airline, and this boy would collapse. Because she didn't just pour coffee on a passenger. She poured it on the legacy of the very man who built the plane she now worked on. And his son? He wasn't done flying. He was just taking off. Preston didn't wipe the coffee off his chest. He didn't need to. The stain, dark, wet, ugly, had already begun to dry, clinging to the smooth wool fabric like it belonged there. But it didn't belong there, just like Harper believed he didn't belong here. From the corner of his eye, Preston watched as she continued laughing with passengers. Not once did she look back. Not once did she apologize. She had moved on. In her mind, the moment was over, an inconvenience, a harmless oops. But Preston hadn't moved on. He had pressed code HH-27 for a reason. He wasn't just documenting an incident. He was activating something much larger. The bracelet on his wrist looked quiet, still, but deep inside, it was already pulsing, pinging a secure signal through multiple encrypted servers, alerting a system that only answered to a very specific chain of command, one that started with his last name. He took a slow breath, steadying his hands on the armrests. Everything in him wanted to speak up, to look Harper in the eye and say, "You don't know who I am, do you?" But that wasn't how his mother raised him, and it wasn't how his father had lived. Henry Hayes had taught him, through books, through silence, through invention, that power wasn't about noise. It was about precision. The man in 2C, still amused, leaned closer. "Hey, kid, you hear me earlier?" he said, lowering his voice. "Didn't mean anything by it, just saying. You stand out in here, that's all." Preston didn't respond. He didn't even turn his head. The man chuckled awkwardly, muttered something under his breath, and turned back toward his scotch. Across the aisle, a young woman, maybe in her late 20s, watched Preston with narrowed eyes. She hadn't laughed, hadn't spoken, but her phone was in her hand now, and she wasn't scrolling. She was filming. Up in the cockpit, a chime echoed through the cabin's communications console. Captain Leonard Marshall frowned at the alert on his screen. "Priority tag? From Hayes Aviation?" he murmured. His co-pilot leaned over. "You ever get one of those before?" "Never," Marshall said. "In 20 years." The message was brief, formal. "Passenger in 2A, advisory alert. Incident reported. Observe and prepare for FAA-directed protocol upon arrival." And then, at the bottom, confirm compliance. Captain Marshall tapped the screen. "Better check with ops." Meanwhile, Preston looked out the window. The sky was vast and blue and calm. It didn't care what seat number he was in. It didn't judge the color of his skin. It didn't laugh when he walked past. Up here, Gravity lost its grip, but people still held on to theirs, to old biases, assumptions, rules about who was allowed to look like they belonged. The suit he wore was a tribute, not a costume. It had been stitched carefully by his father's old friend, a tailor in Boston who used to make suits for pilots and engineers. The thread was strong, but the memory it carried was even stronger. He remembered the day his father wore a suit just like this, dark gray, sleek lapels, initials at the cuff, walking proudly into Sky North headquarters to present the N-17 design specs. Preston had been 5. He remembered how the front desk receptionist asked his father 3 times if he was in the right building, and how his father never raised his voice, just smiled, walked past, proved them all wrong. Now, 8 years later, his son sat in the aircraft that father helped create, being told, with a smirk and a splash of coffee, that he didn't belong here either. But Harper wasn't just a bad apple. She was part of something bigger, a system where first class didn't just mean more legroom, it meant more leeway to judge, exclude, and humiliate. And for years, no one had pushed back hard enough to make that system care. Until today, Preston's phone buzzed in his pocket. He slid it out quietly, checked the screen. Secure notice from Hayes Trust, Ops Center. Code HH27 confirmed. Capital freeze in progress. FAA coordination initiated. Expect action within 10 minutes. He locked the screen again, heartbeat steady. It was happening. A few rows back, the woman with the phone leaned over to her seatmate. "I just sent the clip to my sister. She's a journalist," she whispered. "This story's not staying in the air." Her seatmate nodded, then added, "Good. That kid deserves better." Up front, Harper made another pass through the aisle, clearly avoiding eye contact with Preston. She handed out mixed nuts, refilled drinks, laughed on cue. But something about her gait was tighter now. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Some part of her had noticed, maybe the glances from other passengers, the silence from the cockpit, the quiet way Preston just sat. He wasn't sulking. He was waiting. And that unsettled her. 30 minutes into the flight, a small cluster of passengers had quietly formed a consensus. Something had happened. Something wasn't right. And the boy in the stained suit? He wasn't the problem. He was the beginning of one. Preston adjusted his seat back, then pulled out the tablet from the side pocket. He opened the file labeled Seattle, Memorial Itinerary. At the top was the name Henry Hayes in bold letters, followed by the title, Legacy of Flight, Honoring Visionaries in Aerospace Engineering. He scrolled down to the section labeled Family Speaker, Preston Hayes. He hadn't written his speech yet. He didn't know what to say. Not then. But now, he had a lot to say. Not just about his father, but about everything that happened after. The silence, the disrespect, the small moments that piled up until one of them finally broke. Like a coffee cup in the wrong hands. Suddenly, a ding sounded from the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came on. "We've received a message from ground operations and will be conducting an unscheduled systems review. We appreciate your patience and ask that all passengers remain in their seats with seatbelts fastened." Murmurs filled the cabin. Harper glanced toward the galley, then toward Preston, then away again. But it was too late. The pressure was building, and this time, it wasn't turbulence. It was accountability. Finally, boarding the plane. The hardest part about grief isn't the pain. It's the silence. The part no one talks about. The part that comes after the funeral, when the casserole stops showing up, and people stop asking how you're doing. That's when it gets real. When your world goes quiet, and you realize it's never going back to the way it was. Preston Hayes was 6 the last time he saw his father alive. They had gone out for pancakes that morning. He remembered it like it was yesterday. His dad letting him put extra syrup, even though his mom wouldn't have allowed it. He remembered the way his dad adjusted the cuff of his suit jacket, the one with HH embroidered in gold thread. before he stood up and kissed Preston on the top of his head. "I'll be back in a few days," Henry had said. "Be good. Be brave." Preston had waved from the kitchen window as his dad climbed into the black SUV that would take him to Sky North's testing facility in upstate New York. He never made it back. The N-17's test flight failed 3 days later. A structural anomaly. That's what they called it in the report. Cold, clinical, sterile. But Preston knew what it really meant. Something broke, and no one cared enough to fix it in time. Henry Hayes died in that cockpit, trying to protect a flawed design that he'd begged the company to delay. But they pushed the flight anyway. Too much money on the line. Too many press releases scheduled. Too many egos in charge. The plane hit turbulence, and a key component gave way. Preston's dad tried to stabilize the aircraft, managed to keep it from crashing into the residential area below. But he didn't survive the landing. At the funeral, Preston wore a suit for the first time. It was a little big on him. His mom had rolled the sleeves. He didn't like how tight the collar felt, but he wore it anyway, because it was what his dad would have wanted. He sat between his mother and his Uncle Avery, gripping the folded American flag with both hands. His face was dry the entire time. No tears. Not until later, when they were alone, standing by the grave in the cold wind. Preston finally asked the question he hadn't dared speak during the service. "Was it their fault?" he whispered. His mother didn't answer right away, her lips pressed together, trembling. Then, finally, she said something Preston would never forget. "Sometimes, people don't have to say it was your fault for it to be." She knelt beside him and added one more thing, her voice like gravel and glass. "But I promise you this, Preston. No one will ever erase your father's name from that plane. Ever." 3 years later, his mother was gone too. She fought as hard as she could against the grief, against the silence, against the crushing loneliness that came with losing the man who had been her everything. But some battles are quiet and invisible. It was happening. A few rows back, the woman with the phone leaned over to her seatmate. "I just sent the clip to my sister. She's a journalist," she whispered. "This story's not staying in the air." Her seatmate nodded, then added, "Good. That kid deserves better." Up front, Harper made another pass through the aisle, clearly avoiding eye contact with Preston. She handed out mixed nuts, refilled drinks, laughed on cue. But something about her gait was tighter now. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Some part of her had noticed, maybe the glances from other passengers, the silence from the cockpit, the quiet way Preston just sat. He wasn't sulking. He was waiting. And that unsettled her. 30 minutes into the flight, a small cluster of passengers had quietly formed a consensus. Something had happened. Something wasn't right. And the boy in the stained suit? He wasn't the problem. He was the beginning of one. Preston adjusted his seat back, then pulled out the tablet from the side pocket. He opened the file labeled Seattle, Memorial Itinerary. At the top was the name Henry Hayes in bold letters, followed by the title, Legacy of Flight, Honoring Visionaries in Aerospace Engineering. He scrolled down to the section labeled Family Speaker, Preston Hayes. He hadn't written his speech yet. He didn't know what to say. Not then. But now, he had a lot to say. Not just about his father, but about everything that happened after. The silence, the disrespect, the small moments that piled up until one of them finally broke. Like a coffee cup in the wrong hands. Suddenly, a ding sounded from the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came on. "We've received a message from ground operations and will be conducting an unscheduled systems review. We appreciate your patience and ask that all passengers remain in their seats with seatbelts fastened." Murmurs filled the cabin. Harper glanced toward the galley, then toward Preston, then away again. But it was too late. The pressure was building, and this time, it wasn't turbulence. It was accountability. Finally, boarding the plane. The hardest part about grief isn't the pain, it's the silence. The part no one talks about. The part that comes after the funeral, when the casserole stops showing up and people stop asking how you're doing. That's when it gets real. When your world goes quiet and you realize it's never going back to the way it was. Preston Hayes was 6 the last time he saw his father alive. They had gone out for pancakes that morning. He remembered it like it was yesterday. His dad letting him put extra syrup, even though his mom wouldn't have allowed it. He remembered the way his dad adjusted the cuff of his suit jacket, the one with HH embroidered in gold thread, before he stood up and kissed Preston on the top of his head. "I'll be back in a few days," Henry had said. "Be good, be brave." Preston had waved from the kitchen window as his dad climbed into the black SUV that would take him to SkyNorth's testing facility in upstate New York. He never made it back. The N-17's test flight failed 3 days later, a structural anomaly. That's what they called it in the report. Cold, clinical, sterile. But Preston knew what it really meant. Something broke, and no one cared enough to fix it in time. Henry Hayes died in that cockpit, trying to protect a flawed design that he'd begged the company to delay, but they pushed the flight anyway. Too much money on the line, too many press releases scheduled, too many egos in charge. The plane hit turbulence, and a key component gave way. Preston's dad tried to stabilize the aircraft, managed to keep it from crashing into the residential area below, but he didn't survive the landing. At the funeral, Preston wore a suit for the first time. It was a little big on him. His mom had rolled the sleeves. He didn't like how tight the collar felt, but he wore it anyway, because it was what his dad would have wanted. He sat between his mother and his Uncle Avery, gripping the folded American flag with both hands. His face was dry the entire time. No tears. Not until later, when they were alone, standing by the grave in the cold wind. Preston finally asked the question he hadn't dared speak during the service. "Was it their fault?" he whispered. His mother didn't answer right away, her lips pressed together, trembling. Then, finally, she said something Preston would never forget. "Sometimes, people don't have to say it was your fault for it to be." She knelt beside him and added one more thing, her voice like gravel and glass. "But I promise you this, Preston. No one will ever erase your father's name from that plane. Ever." 3 years later, his mother was gone too. She fought as hard as she could against the grief, against the silence, against the crushing loneliness that came with losing the man who had been her everything. But some battles are quiet and invisible. He remembered the way she said his name one last time, the way her fingers tightened just slightly before going still. At 9 years old, Preston Hayes became an orphan. Uncle Avery took him in without hesitation, but not just out of obligation. Avery was Henry's younger brother, the quiet one, the finance guy, the less famous Hayes. But he adored his nephew, raised him with steel and softness, taught him everything Henry would have taught, and then some. He showed Preston how the aviation industry really worked, where the money flowed, who pulled the strings, what power looked like behind closed doors. He also gave Preston the one thing no one else could: control. Through the Henry Hayes Aviation Trust, Preston became more than just a legacy. He became a decision maker. At 12, he had an encrypted ID. At 13, he could approve or suspend capital disbursements. Not alone, not recklessly, but with access. Real access. And when Uncle Avery saw that look in Preston's eyes, that same fire Henry had carried into every design review, every cockpit, every challenge, he knew the boy was ready, which brought them to this flight, to the suit Preston had chosen himself, to the monogram he insisted be stitched by hand, just like his father's, to seat 2A. The exact seat Henry had flown in during his final commercial flight. He wasn't here for show. He was here to honor a promise. And now, Harper Langston had dumped hot coffee on that suit, had laughed in his face, had made a joke out of the one moment he wanted to feel close to his father again. That wasn't just a mistake. It was a desecration. But Preston didn't raise his voice, didn't fight back. Because this wasn't just about him. This was about everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong somewhere they'd earned. In the jet's rear crew area, Harper scrolled her phone behind the curtain. She'd been trying to get a signal for 20 minutes, but the Wi-Fi kept booting her off. Weird. She glanced over her shoulder at the first-class cabin. That kid still hadn't moved, still hadn't complained. She didn't like it. People who made a scene? Easy. You dealt with them. Filed a report, moved on. But kids like that, quiet ones who watched instead of reacted, they were dangerous. Back in 2A, Preston stared out the window. The Rocky Mountains stretched beneath them in jagged silence. He placed his palm on the armrest. The bracelet on his wrist hummed faintly against his skin. A signal pulsing across airspace, into ground servers, into capital systems that would start triggering dominoes, big ones, $3.8 billion in floating credit. Frozen, 14 aircraft schedules. Paused, 3 international gates. Delayed, scrutinized. And Harper Langston? She was about to be investigated by the same system that paid her paycheck. He didn't do it for revenge. He did it for the principle. Because if he let this go, if even he, with all his access and leverage and name, let it slide, what chance did the next kid have? The one who didn't wear a suit. The one who didn't have $1 billion trust behind them. The one whose story never went viral. This wasn't about making noise. This was about making change. From the seat pocket in front of him, Preston pulled out a thin leather journal. It was his father's. The cover was scratched, edges worn. Inside were notes on aircraft design, quotes from old textbooks, sketches of fuselage cross-sections. But near the back, scribbled in Henry's quick, slanted handwriting, was a single sentence. You don't fix the airframe after it breaks in the sky. You reinforce it before takeoff. Preston ran his finger over the words, then closed the book. He had work to do. The seatbelt sign was still on, but the tension in the first-class cabin had already unbuckled itself. Something had changed. It wasn't loud. No one had raised their voice. No flight attendant had made an announcement. But the air, thick, silent, electric, told everyone the same thing. Whatever just happened wasn't going to be swept under the rug. Preston sat calmly in seat 2A, his father's journal now resting in his lap. He hadn't written anything yet, but the pen was in his hand, uncapped, ready. Across the aisle, Harper Langston was visibly less composed. She had started pacing. At first it looked like routine, just a flight attendant doing her rounds. But passengers began noticing the extra tightness in her steps, the way she checked her phone every few minutes, even though there was barely a signal, the way she glanced toward the cockpit, then toward Preston, and then away. In the cockpit, Captain Leonard Marshall was reviewing the latest alert from operations. FAA liaison team is mobilized, he read aloud. His co-pilot raised an eyebrow. That fast? HH-27 protocol, the captain said grimly. You know what that means? The younger pilot nodded. Preston Hayes. They both knew the name. Everyone in the aviation industry did. Preston, meanwhile, hadn't moved. Not since the captain's first announcement. He didn't need to, because while others were reacting in real time, he was already 3 steps ahead. 7 minutes earlier, when the system confirmation came through on his secure band, Preston had quietly adjusted the protocol to escalate from observation to provisional freeze. What that meant, in practice, every open line of capital extended from the Hayes Aviation Trust to SkyNorth had just been flagged. The airline's board of directors had been pinged with a high-priority compliance review, and the CEO's direct line had received a time-sensitive alert advisory linked to potential ethics violation mid-flight. It didn't accuse. It didn't name Harper. It just asked a question. Does your cabin crew reflect the values your funding depends on? Far below, at SkyNorth's corporate office in Atlanta, an emergency meeting had been called in the boardroom. The CFO's face was pale. Why haven't I seen this before? One board member asked, tapping the alert notification. The COO didn't respond immediately. She was still refreshing her inbox, hoping, futilely, that a retraction would come through. "It's real," she said at last. "Hayes Trust just froze $820 million in credit lines." Someone cursed under their breath. "Is this about that kid?" "No," another board member said darkly. "This is about the kid's last name." Back on Flight 6018, Harper finally approached Preston again. She didn't kneel, didn't look him in the eye, just leaned over slightly and whispered, "Would you like a fresh shirt from the amenity kit?" It wasn't an apology. It was a move, an attempt at recovery. Preston turned toward her, calm and direct. "No, thank you," he said, his voice level. "This one tells the story better." Harper blinked. The message was clear. He knew, not just what had happened, but what it meant, and worse, who he was. Preston shifted slightly and pulled the small notebook from his backpack, the one he'd brought to write his speech in for the memorial tonight. But he didn't write the speech. He wrote a sentence, just one. "The plane my father died building just taught me that silence isn't safety, it's armor." Row 3B, an older black woman in a green blouse, watched the whole interaction. She leaned slightly toward the man beside her. "I don't know who that boy is," she murmured, "but that woman's face says he's about to change the game." The man beside her nodded. "I hope he burns the whole system down," he said quietly. "The quiet ones always do." In the galley, another flight attendant, Sophia, finally pulled Harper aside. "You need to tell the truth," Sophia whispered. "This is getting serious." Harper scoffed. "It was an accident." He hasn't said a word. "And you're unraveling," Sophia said. "That's not an accident, that's guilt." Meanwhile, in Westport, Avery Hayes stepped into his private conference room. The entire room was dark, lit only by a massive screen showing live operational data from 5 airlines. His COO stood waiting. "They just tried to reroute capital through a side account," she said. "Looks like they're panicking." "Keep freezing," Avery said. "Let them feel it." Then he turned to his assistant. "Has Preston checked in?" "Yes, sir. He triggered provisional phase 2. Avery let out a long breath. "Good." In the cabin, the ripple effects began showing. The Wi-Fi signal went down completely, disabled by flight ops at the request of the Trust's security team to avoid digital manipulation or spin. The captain made another vague announcement. More passengers were now on edge. Some were annoyed. Some were curious. But a handful had already figured it out. This was bigger than spilled coffee. This was about who gets protected in the sky and who doesn't. Preston turned the page in his notebook and wrote again. "They always say the sky's the limit, until someone like me reaches it." He stared at the words a moment, then underlined them. Down in the cargo hold, someone else was stirring. The onboard air marshal. He hadn't intervened earlier. Nothing had qualified. But the captain had quietly briefed him on the HH-27 tag and the implications of passenger misconduct affecting public confidence and contractual obligations. It was bureaucratic language, but translated? If this went viral, heads would roll. And if he didn't act, one of them might be his. Preston returned the notebook to his bag. He wasn't angry. He was ready. His father used to say that aviation wasn't about speed. It was about timing, and now, every clock on this flight was ticking. Just as Harper tried to disappear behind the curtain again, the cabin phone rang. She picked it up, startled. A pause. Then her face drained of color. She turned, walked to the front of the cabin, and disappeared into the cockpit. Preston didn't move, but his eyes followed her. Steady, quiet, unshaken. 10 seconds later, the co-pilot emerged and walked directly to 2A. He knelt slightly. "Mr. Hayes," he said carefully, "the captain would like to speak with you privately." It was the first time someone said his name, and just like that, everything changed. The cockpit door opened slowly. Preston stepped forward, notebook still in hand, his wristband flickering faintly under the sleeve of his blazer. The captain gave a subtle nod as the co-pilot stepped aside, letting the boy through. No one else in first class said a word, but every eye followed him. The kid who hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a scene, hadn't threatened anyone. And yet, now the pilot wanted a private word. Inside the cockpit, Captain Leonard Marshall gestured toward the small jump seat behind him. "Have a seat, son," he said. Preston sat quietly, legs together, posture straight. The captain studied him for a moment. He wasn't sure what he had expected. A meltdown? A tantrum? A kid playing dress-up? But what he saw was a young man who looked prepared. "Your signal was received," Marshall said finally, lowering his voice. "And your identity has been verified." Preston nodded. No surprise, no satisfaction, just confirmation. "I assume you understand what's already in motion," the captain added. "I do," Preston replied calmly. "But I'm not here to escalate anything." Marshall raised an eyebrow. "You froze almost $1 billion in active credit lines. That's escalation, son." Preston didn't flinch. "It's accountability." The captain exhaled. The kid had backbone. He'd give him that. Preston looked out through the windshield at the endless sky. For a second, he imagined what his father had seen from here, what it felt like to sit in this chair, not as a passenger, but as a builder, a protector of lives, a craftsman of machines that could fly. "I'm not angry," Preston said quietly. Marshall turned to him. "But what she did, it wasn't just about me. She poured that coffee on my father's name, and that's not something I can let slide." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. The kind of silence you give a man speaking at a memorial, even if that man is only 13. The captain leaned forward. "I've filed the incident log. FAA will have it by the time we land. They've already flagged the crew manifest. Ground teams will be waiting." Preston gave a small nod. "And the other passengers? We haven't made any public announcements. Yet. My team's still evaluating how to de-escalate once we land." Preston held the captain's gaze. "You can try," he said, "but I don't think this ends quietly." Meanwhile, in first class, the cabin felt like a ticking clock. Everyone had questions. No one dared ask them. Until the woman in 3B, Mrs. Hayes, no relation, stood up slowly and walked to the galley, where Sophia was silently refilling coffee cups. "Is he all right?" she asked softly. Sophia hesitated, then nodded. "He's calm, focused." Mrs. Hayes tilted her head. "Who is he?" Sophia looked over both shoulders, then leaned in. "You didn't hear this from me, but that boy owns more of this airline than the people running it." At the rear of the plane, Harper sat stiffly on the crew bench, arms folded tight across her chest. Her phone buzzed again, but there was still no service. A voice behind her broke the silence. "Why didn't you just say sorry?" She turned to see Sophia. Harper rolled her eyes. "Because I didn't do anything wrong." Sophia stared at her. "You poured hot coffee on a child, Harper, and you smirked." "It was an accident," Harper said through gritted teeth. "And he's not a child. He's a—" She stopped. A beat. Too late. The word had nearly slipped out, and Sophia caught it. "You were going to say something else, weren't you?" Harper turned away, jaw clenched. Sophia didn't push. She didn't have to. Back in the cockpit, the captain stood and extended a hand. "Whatever happens next," he said, "you've conducted yourself with more composure than most grown men I've flown." Preston rose and shook the captain's hand, then turned back toward the door. He paused for a moment before leaving, then said, "My father once wrote, 'You don't fix the airframe after it breaks in the sky.'" Marshall blinked. "That's Hayes' engineering doctrine." "It was my dad's doctrine," Preston replied. "That's why I'm here." And then he stepped out. The moment he re-entered the cabin, the atmosphere shifted again. Harper had returned to her duties, but barely. Passengers now whispered as he passed, but not with mockery, with respect. Mrs. Hayes in 3B gave him a slight nod. The woman in 2D, the one who'd filmed Harper earlier, offered a half smile. Preston just walked back to his seat and sat. Same posture, same focus. But now, everyone knew who he was. Down on the ground, Avery Hayes sat in a dark leather chair in his private office, phone to his ear. He spoke to the captain, the COO said, and handled himself like a man. Avery nodded once. Good. He turned to his terminal and opened the internal memo he'd drafted before the flight even took off. Subject: Compliance Initiative. Preston Clause. Effective immediately, all airline partners receiving capital from the Hayes Aviation Trust will be required to establish passenger dignity protocols. Failure to comply will result in suspension of funding. He didn't type another word. He didn't need to. The sky had already begun to change. Back in seat 2A, Preston flipped to a new page in his notebook. He looked around at the cabin one more time, then wrote, "They looked at the boy in the suit and saw a problem. What they didn't see was that the suit belonged to the man who designed the sky they fly through." He capped his pen, closed the notebook, and waited for landing. The moment the wheels touched down at LAX, the cabin applauded. It was the kind of polite, half-hearted clap you get after a long flight. More relief than celebration. But Preston didn't clap. He never did. His eyes were fixed on the window, watching the world roll by in reverse. Terminals, ground crew, fuel trucks, all blurring past. Somewhere out there, decisions were being made, and none of them were small. The captain's voice came on overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles. For operational reasons, we ask that all passengers in first class remain seated until instructed otherwise. Thank you." A ripple moved through the cabin. That wasn't normal. In seat 2A, Preston sat straight-backed, hands folded neatly over his notebook. He could feel the energy around him shifting. The murmurs, the sideways glances, the flight attendants moving with forced smiles. But more than anything, the silence. The kind of silence that comes before something breaks. 2 rows back, Mrs. Hayes whispered to her husband, "They're trying to contain this." Her husband nodded. "But it's too late." At the front of the cabin, Harper stood frozen near the curtain, fingers tightening around the edge of the galley counter. She could see them through the crack in the door. 3 people in black suits. One held a tablet, another an FAA badge. The third wore a Sky North lanyard with Director Operations printed in bold under his name. They weren't here for routine debriefing. They were here for her. The intercom crackled again. "Preston Hayes, please remain seated. A representative from Hayes Aviation Trust and FAA Compliance will be boarding momentarily to speak with you directly." The cabin froze. So did Harper. In the back, one of the younger flight attendants gasped softly. "Oh my God," she whispered to Sophia. "He really is." Sophia nodded once. "Told you." Preston didn't move, didn't fidget. He simply took off his seatbelt, closed his notebook, and placed it gently into his leather satchel. He had already written what needed to be said. The aircraft door hissed open. Cool air flooded in from the jet bridge, and with it came power. Not loud, not aggressive, just quiet, direct, absolute. Avery Hayes stepped on board first, wearing a charcoal suit and expression carved from marble. Behind him, FAA Compliance Officer Melissa Grant followed, tablet in hand. And trailing them, the Sky North director, red-faced, clearly sweating under the collar, walked like a man already halfway fired. Harper shrank backward into the galley. But there was no escape. Avery's gaze cut across the cabin like a laser, and then it landed on her. Harper flinched, but he didn't speak. Didn't need to. Just turned to Preston and nodded. The moment the passengers realized what was happening, phones came out. Quietly, discreetly, but not too discreet. Melissa Grant spoke first. "Per FAA Advisory Protocol, we are conducting an onboard review of an incident involving a minor, an airline employee, and potential Title VI violation." She turned to Harper. You will remain on the aircraft until instructed otherwise." Harper opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The Sky North director cleared his throat. "We'd like to, sincerely apologize, Mr. Hayes, on behalf of Sky North. This does not reflect our values." Preston looked up. His voice was quiet. "Do you even know what happened?" The man stuttered. "Well, we were briefed, but we'd like to review." "You mean someone spilled coffee and suddenly half your airline is frozen?" The man stopped mid-sentence. Preston tilted his head slightly. "I didn't ask for anything," he said. "I didn't post a video. I didn't make a call." He looked directly at Harper. "I just sat still." A pause. Then, "And your entire system exposed itself." Gasps whispered through the cabin. Mrs. Hayes actually closed her eyes in satisfaction. Avery stepped forward now, voice calm but undeniable. "Preston won't be answering questions until legal counsel is present." He turned to Melissa. "However, per protocol, we'd like to submit his written statement and supporting documentation for official review." Preston handed over the notebook. Melissa glanced down, saw the first page. "They thought I was a passenger. I was actually their audit." She blinked, then nodded. Outside, on the tarmac, 3 news vans were already setting up by Gate 47. Word had gotten out, and it wasn't going away. Avery turned back to Preston. "You ready to go?" Preston stood, adjusted the cuffs of his blazer, and nodded once. He looked around the cabin one last time. At Harper, silent, shaking. At the passengers, eyes wide, silent. At Sophia, who gave him a discreet nod of solidarity. And then he walked off the plane. No fanfare, no press conference. Just a kid in a suit with a notebook and a name that couldn't be erased. Back on board, Harper finally sat down. Or collapsed. It was hard to tell. In the Hayes Trust headquarters 48 minutes later, the following email went out to every airline partner in their funding network. Subject: New mandate, the Hayes Standard. All aviation partners are required to implement independent cabin ethics auditing, dignity protection protocols, and Title VI sensitivity training for all onboard personnel. Non-compliance will result in immediate capital suspension. Preston didn't see that email. He didn't need to. He was already walking toward the exit doors of LAX with Avery, the sun warming his back. "I still want to give my speech tonight," he said. Avery raised an eyebrow. "Even after all this?" "Especially after all this. Because this was never about a coffee stain. It was about who gets to feel safe at 30,000 feet, and who gets to decide what happens when they're not." The hotel ballroom wasn't grand. No velvet curtains, no chandeliers. Just a humble podium at the front of the room, a banner reading Henry Hayes Memorial Youth Innovation Forum, and a quiet buzz of expectation that filled the air like static. Preston stood behind the curtain, peeking through the edge. Rows of folding chairs filled with mentors, students, professors, even a few press. His name was already printed on the program. Keynote speaker, Preston Hayes, and under it, in smaller font, son of Henry Hayes, founder of Hayes Aerospace Research Trust. But that wasn't why people were whispering. They were whispering because now they recognized his face. Less than 12 hours had passed since he stepped off that flight. But the footage had already gone viral. Clips of Preston sitting silently in his stained suit. The moment the FAA officer said his full name. Harper Langston's frozen expression. The phrase, "I just sat still, and your entire system exposed itself." It was everywhere. Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, CNN. A 13-year-old boy had held the airline industry accountable without ever raising his voice. And tonight, he was being introduced not just as a young inventor, but as the kid in 2A. Avery leaned over beside him. "You sure you want to do this? We can delay." Preston shook his head. "No, I want to finish what I started." Avery nodded, then stepped back into the crowd. When Preston walked on stage, no music played. No spotlight followed him. But still, the room stood up. Not clapping, just standing. Like a courtroom does when the judge enters, or a town does when a soldier returns home. Preston adjusted the mic, then looked out at the audience. Older faces, young students, reporters, strangers, and then said simply, "My name is Preston Hayes. I'm here today because of two things: my father and a flight attendant who thought I didn't belong in first class." A pause. The audience froze, not in shock, but in attention. No one dared look away. Preston took out the notebook, same one from the flight, same leather, same pages. "I wasn't planning to talk about what happened on Flight 618, he said, "but now I think maybe I have to." He opened the notebook. "Because if I don't, people might think I got lucky, or that someone powerful stepped in and saved me." He looked up. "But that's not true. No one saved me." A longer pause. "I saved myself by remembering who I am and who came before me." He flipped a page. "My dad died designing the plane I was flying on. He warned the company about flaws. They ignored him. He flew anyway, and when it failed, he made sure no one else died." Preston's voice didn't crack. It sharpened. "That kind of sacrifice deserves better than a coffee stain." The audience leaned forward. "When that flight attendant spilled her drink on me, she didn't just see a black kid in a suit. She saw someone she thought didn't belong, and she acted like it." Preston didn't raise his voice. He lowered it. "And she was wrong. I belonged in that seat, not because of my last name or my family trust. I belonged because dignity isn't something you earn. It's something you're born with." The crowd stirred now, audible, emotional. He closed the notebook. "No kid should need power to be treated like a person." And then, "But if I have it, I'm going to use it." For the first time, someone clapped. Then a second. Not polite applause, standing ovation. A kind of grateful release. A collective thank you from every person who had ever been humiliated in silence. As Preston stepped down from the stage, an older man approached. Vietnam vet cap. Tears in his eyes. "You made me proud, son," he said, voice trembling. "I've been waiting 50 years to see a kid say what you just said." That night, Preston didn't go viral because he made a scene. He went viral because he told the truth, quietly, clearly, without shame. And the world finally listened. 3 days after the memorial speech, the CEO of Sky North held a press conference. Not in front of cameras, not in a hotel ballroom, but inside a closed-door meeting with the Department of Transportation, 2 members of the FAA Civil Rights Division, and one quietly furious Avery Hayes. The CEO, Richard Callahan, had flown in from Zurich just hours before. His voice was hoarse, tie loose, palms damp. He opened with a shaky sentence. "We had no idea who the boy was." Avery didn't flinch. He didn't have to. Everyone in the room knew the truth. It wasn't about who Preston was. It was about who they thought he wasn't. At that exact moment, Preston Hayes was sitting in the back of a small public school auditorium in South Central Los Angeles. Not to speak, not to be honored, but to listen. A group of middle schoolers were presenting STEM projects: battery-powered fans, makeshift water filters, a recycled drone. And at the edge of the stage, a handmade poster read, "For Preston Hayes, you gave us permission to dream big." He hadn't expected that. He just wanted to drop by quietly, shake a few hands, encourage a few kids. Instead, he found himself wiping his eyes behind his glasses. Later that evening, back in his hotel room, Preston turned on the TV. CNN was covering his story again, but this time the headline read, "FAA launches systemic bias review across 6 major airlines following Hayes incident." Below that, 12 flight attendants across 4 airlines had come forward. 3 executives had been suspended, and Harper Langston, officially fired. Preston didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. Because he wasn't chasing punishment. He was chasing prevention. In another part of the country, Harper sat on her mother's porch in Missouri, scrolling through her phone. No job, no severance. Her inbox flooded with news alerts and hate mail. But what hit hardest wasn't the backlash. It was the mirror. For the first time, she was forced to replay her actions in her head, frame by frame. The way she laughed, the way she spoke, the way she looked down at him. And slowly, shame replaced defensiveness. No one else was around to witness it. But in that moment, for the first time in her life, Harper Langston apologized out loud. The Hayes Aviation Trust went quiet publicly. But behind the scenes, Avery and Preston met with regulators, civil rights leaders, and aviation boards. What began as a single advisory notice became a multi-phase initiative. The Hayes Standard, a required code of conduct across all partner airlines, centered around passenger dignity, race and bias de-escalation training, anonymous onboard reporting systems, FAA compliance audits every 90 days. Within 6 weeks, the policy had been adopted by 4 major airlines and was under review by 2 more. Preston never made another public statement, but he didn't need to. Other voices began rising in his place. A retired flight attendant who once got reprimanded for defending a Latino couple in first class. A young black pilot who'd been passed over 5 times despite perfect flight scores. A military veteran who'd been asked to change seats because he didn't look like a colonel. Stories that had lived in silence for years were now everywhere, and no one was brushing them aside. Because Preston Hayes had cracked something open. One afternoon, Avery found Preston sitting at the kitchen counter, sketching in his father's old journal. Working on something? Preston shrugged. Maybe. Avery sat down. You've done more in 2 weeks than some people do in their whole career. Preston looked up. Do you think it's really going to change anything? Avery studied his nephew's face, then said quietly, the system won't change because you made noise. It'll change because you built something that made silence impossible. Preston didn't respond. He just nodded and kept sketching. That evening, his notebook sat open on the nightstand. On the last page, in his smallest handwriting, he wrote, I didn't want to be the kid who made the airline tremble. I just wanted to be the kid in 2A, sitting in his father's seat, wearing his father's suit, proving that he belonged. And now, he had. The call came from an unknown number. Preston usually didn't answer those, but something in his gut told him to pick up. Preston Hayes? The voice said. Yes, speaking. This is Director Collins from the Office of Civil Aviation Policy. Secretary Martinez would like to meet with you, in person. Preston blinked. He was 13. He still had algebra homework due. But now he was getting summoned to Washington, D.C., not as a student, but as a systems changer. That same evening, Avery knocked on Preston's bedroom door, holding an envelope. What's that? Preston asked. Avery handed it over. Read it. Inside was a letter, on White House stationery, an invitation to speak before the Congressional Committee on Transportation. They want you to testify? Preston asked, wide-eyed. Avery nodded. You're not just a passenger anymore, son. You're a precedent. 3 weeks later, Preston stood in front of an arched oak door inside the Rayburn House office building. He was wearing a navy blue suit, just like his dad used to wear. Gold cufflinks. No tie. And inside his jacket pocket, folded 3 times, was the final page of his father's engineering journal, the one he'd never shown anyone. Until now. The hearing room was packed. Cameras lined the back wall. Reporters whispered into tiny mics. Lawmakers rustled their papers, half reading, half watching Preston like a puzzle they hadn't solved yet. One congressman leaned over to his aide and whispered, That's the coffee kid, right? His aide nodded. Kid in 2A. And just like that, a nickname was born. The chairwoman tapped her gavel gently. Mr. Hayes, thank you for being here. You may begin. Preston stood. No notes, no teleprompter, just his voice, and the weight of a system behind him. My name is Preston Hayes. I'm 13 years old. I was born in Atlanta, and on April 3rd, I boarded Flight 618 to LAX. He paused. Let the moment settle. It was supposed to be just another flight, but someone on that plane decided I didn't belong in first class. He turned slightly to look each lawmaker in the eye, not because I did anything wrong, but because of how I look and how young I am, and what they assumed I wasn't. A low murmur passed through the room. Preston continued. She poured hot coffee on me, laughed, smirked, and no one did anything until I tapped the system my father built. Now people were leaning forward, senators, staffers. Even a few reporters stopped typing. Preston's voice didn't shake. If I hadn't been who I am, with the name I carry, I'd still be just a kid with a burn on his arm and no apology. The silence was loud. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the final page from the journal, held it up. This is my father's. He died building the plane I flew on, and on this page, he wrote something I didn't understand. Until now. He read, "When the systems fail you in the sky, you better make damn sure the systems on the ground don't." Preston folded the page back up. "And that's why I'm here." The room burst into spontaneous applause. Unscripted, unpermitted, but deeply earned. One congresswoman whispered, "This kid's gonna change aviation." Another murmured, "He already did." Later that night, the hearing replayed on every major network. TikTok stitched his soundbite 100 different ways. YouTube channels called it the most elegant takedown of corporate bias ever delivered by a teenager. Even Reddit, famously brutal, had a thread titled, "Serious kid in 2A might have just saved lives." Quick break. Tell us where you're watching from. Were you on a flight that ever made you feel out of place? Drop A if you've ever had to keep quiet when someone crossed the line. Let's keep this space safe and loud. By the end of that week, 2 major airline CEOs resigned. FAA opened a civil rights oversight office, and the Hays Standard became a non-negotiable clause in all public-private aviation contracts. Meanwhile, Preston returned to school. The science fair team greeted him with wide eyes and awkward high fives. One girl whispered, "We watched your speech in homeroom. My mom cried." Preston smiled. Another boy leaned in. "Do you still have the suit?" "Dry cleaned," Preston replied, grinning. But fame wasn't what he carried now. Responsibility was. One night, while brushing his teeth, he looked at himself in the mirror and asked a question most adults still avoid. Now that they're listening, what are you going to say next? He didn't have the answer yet, but he knew one thing. He'd never sit in silence again. 6 weeks after the hearing, a letter arrived. Not an email, not a press release. A real handwritten letter. It came in a navy envelope with a gold seal. From Harper Langston. Preston didn't open it right away. He stared at it for a full 10 minutes. Letting the weight of it settle into his palm. When he finally unfolded the paper, he read slowly, line by line. It wasn't long. No excuses, no corporate lingo, just one line that mattered. "I'm sorry for what I did to you, and what I assumed about you." Then, below it, in smaller handwriting, "You reminded me who I never want to be again." He didn't reply. Didn't need to. Some things you acknowledge in silence, not to let them off the hook, but because not everything deserves a second round. The next day, at the Hays Trust Building, Avery slid a folder across the table. "Ready for this?" Preston opened it. Inside, a proposal to expand the Hays Standard globally. 10 more airlines, multinational regulators, cabin accountability tech built into every major aircraft built after 2028. But Preston flipped past the numbers. His eyes stopped on the name of the new initiative, Passenger Dignity Index. He smiled. "Yeah," he said, "I'm ready." But he didn't stay in the boardroom. He asked Avery for the afternoon off, then slipped out the side door of the building. No suit, no notebook, just jeans, sneakers, and a quiet mission. He took the train 2 stops downtown, walked 6 blocks past graffiti and corner stores, stopped in front of Jefferson Elementary, the school he'd gone to before scholarships and science fairs, where teachers still remembered his name, where kids still believed in rocket ships, and where one small display case now held a picture of a boy in a wrinkled Navy suit, captioned simply, Seat 2A. Inside, in the library, 20 kids sat cross-legged on a worn-out rug. A teacher whispered, "They don't know you're coming." Preston stepped forward. No applause, just gasps. One boy in the front row asked, "You really made an airline change the rules?" Preston laughed. "I didn't make them. I just reminded them the rules were supposed to protect everyone." Another girl raised her hand. "Were you scared?" He paused, then nodded. "I was, but I wasn't alone." He knelt beside her. "You don't have to be loud to make change," he said. "You just have to be clear and brave and true." She smiled. So did he. Then he stood and said what he came there to say. "The world isn't fixed yet, but if it ever is, it'll be because of kids like you." Outside, the sun was setting across the skyline. Preston looked up at the fading streaks of jet exhaust. He didn't know where the plane was headed, but he knew one thing. Wherever it went, someone like him belonged there too. The event was held at the National Museum of Flight and Human Achievement. Not the biggest venue, not the most glamorous, but somehow it felt right. The atrium had glass ceilings where sunlight poured through and danced across suspended aircraft models, each one a piece of someone's dream. And in the center of the main hall, surrounded by quiet elegance, stood a new exhibit, Seat 2A, When a Boy Challenged the Sky. Preston didn't know what to say at first. He just stood there, frozen, as people walked by, reading the plaque beneath a carefully preserved leather seat from Flight 617. It was scorched faintly on the armrest, just enough to still tell the story. Beside it was a digital screen looping footage from the congressional hearing. Preston's quiet words echoing in the room like something sacred. "You okay?" Avery asked, walking up beside him. Preston nodded slowly. "It feels bigger than me now," he whispered. Avery placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's because it is." That night, dignitaries, educators, pilots, and engineers gathered under the exhibits for a private ceremony. A senator introduced him as the youngest civilian ever to influence federal aviation regulation. The Secretary of Transportation called him a living compass. Preston said thank you, but the only speech he gave was this: "People always ask if I'd do it all over again, and my answer is, I wish I didn't have to, but I'm proud I did." Then he walked off the stage, simple, direct, himself. Later, by the display, a woman approached him. She wore a navy blazer, FAA badge clipped to her belt, hair streaked with silver. "You don't know me," she said, "but I used to be a flight attendant." Preston smiled. "Nice to meet you." She looked at the exhibit. "I've poured 1,000 coffees," she said, always nervous when the passenger was young and black. Not because I didn't trust them, but because I didn't trust the system to protect them, or me, if something went wrong. She turned to him. "You cracked it open, Preston." Then paused. "And I just wanted to say thank you for making room." Preston didn't respond right away, but inside, something settled. Not pride, not ego, but peace. The kind that only comes when your voice opens a door that stays open for others. The next morning, the museum posted a photo of the exhibit with a simple caption: "This seat is no longer just a seat. It's proof that stillness can be revolutionary." Back home, life didn't slow down. Preston returned to his school routine, but it wasn't routine anymore. Students treated him differently. So did teachers. But Preston made a point to show up as himself. He still forgot his lunch sometimes, still hated gym class, still lost track of time reading in the library. But in every classroom he walked into, he made sure of one thing: every kid knew they belonged. One day in science class, his teacher wheeled in a box. "Preston, I think this one's yours." He opened it. Inside, a letter from NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, an invitation to visit tour and present his ideas on aircraft safety and youth feedback in cabin design. The class erupted in cheers. Preston smiled, then passed the box around so everyone could see. Because that's what this had always been about, making space, not just for himself, but for everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong on the plane, in the room, or in the sky. That evening, back at home, he wrote in his new journal, "The world didn't change because I yelled. It changed because I waited, then spoke, when silence was no longer an option." He folded the page once, slid it into the back pocket of his backpack, and looked out the window at the stars just starting to blink through the clouds. Somewhere, a flight was climbing into the night, and he hoped, he truly hoped, there was a kid in 2A who felt safe this time. A year had passed since Flight 618. 1 full year since a 13-year-old boy boarded a plane in his father's old suit and left with the world watching. The headlines had faded. The social media firestorm had burned out. But what Preston started was still moving, quietly, persistently, like pressure beneath the wings of an aircraft. Not a trend, a shift. It started with small things. Flight attendant training manuals were rewritten. Pre-boarding announcements began including a new line. "We are committed to treating all passengers with dignity, regardless of age, background, or appearance." Cabin crews were briefed with digital prompts before every takeoff, reminding them that every passenger has a story you don't know. And on some flights, tucked behind seat 2A, there was now a small brass plaque. It read, "This seat was once occupied by someone who sat still and made the world move." Preston didn't see that plaque for months. He'd been busy with school, still balancing the weirdness of being both a regular 8th grader and a national symbol. But one day in April, almost exactly 1 year later, he and Avery were boarding a flight to New York. An event at Columbia University was honoring Henry Hayes' legacy in aerospace ethics. They walked through the jet bridge, turned left into first class, and then Preston froze. Seat 2A was open, but not empty. On the headrest was a printed sign, "Reserved." And beside it, a flight attendant smiled and said, "We were told to make this available in case he decided to fly with us again." Preston looked at Avery. Avery nodded. "You should sit there." As Preston settled into the seat, the same seat where it all began, something inside him clicked into place. He didn't feel small anymore. Didn't feel like he was borrowing a space. He felt like he belonged. Because now, that space belonged to more than just him. The flight attendant, different from last year, approached with a quiet smile. "Anything I can get for you, Mr. Hayes?" Preston looked up. "No, ma'am," he said. "I'm just taking it all in." She nodded, then added softly, "My little brother goes to Jefferson Elementary. They still talk about you." The plane took off smoothly, slicing into the clouds without turbulence. Preston opened his notebook, now a newer one, navy blue with stitched corners, and wrote only 3 words on a fresh page. "Sky remembers everything." Meanwhile, back in Los Angeles, something else was happening. In a private boardroom at Sky North's headquarters, the CEO was handing over a letter of resignation. No scandal, no press release, just an understanding. That in a new era, old leadership couldn't fly on autopilot anymore. Across the country, more students were citing the Hayes Standard in debate competitions. In Detroit, a group of teens launched a startup inspired by Preston's story. Focused on bias detection and customer service AI, in Florida, a school renamed its aviation program the Preston Hayes Institute for Ethical Flight Design. But none of this ever made Preston arrogant. If anything, it made him quieter, more reflective, more aware of how many people it had taken, not just to support him, but to stand behind a moment that changed everything. That spring, he received a message from Harper Langston. This time, not a letter, a video. She was standing in front of a class of flight attendant trainees. Her badge now read DEI Training Consultant, Langston Consulting Group. She said, "I used to think I was the authority in the cabin. Now I know I'm just part of the crew, and the job is to serve safely and with humility. A boy in 2A taught me that. Preston watched the video twice, then closed his laptop and smiled. Later that year, a documentary premiered at Sundance titled Seat 2A, The Boy Who Changed the Sky. It opened with raw footage of the cabin that day. Harper's hand, the spilled coffee, Preston's stillness. But it didn't end there. It ended with classroom scenes, airport lobbies, policy documents, smiles, apologies, change. It ended with hope. One moment, however, wasn't in the film, because no one had recorded it. It happened in a church basement in Atlanta where Preston and Avery volunteered on Sundays. After a meal, a woman approached them with her son, maybe 8 years old, wearing a too-big coat and a shy smile. The mother said, "We were going to take a bus to see his grandpa in Chicago, but he said, 'Can we fly? Like the boy from the video?'" Avery looked at the kid. "You ever been on a plane before?" The boy shook his head. "Scared?" Avery asked. The boy nodded. Then Preston knelt, eye level. "You don't have to be scared," he said. "The sky's different now." The boy smiled. So did his mom. That night, Preston wrote again. "Maybe I didn't change the world. Maybe I just made space for someone who will. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything. Before you go, have you ever sat in seat 2A? Not on a plane, but in life. That one spot where people looked at you like you didn't belong, where they made assumptions before they knew your story. Maybe you stayed quiet, or maybe you spoke up, and everything changed. Tell us where you're watching from. And if this story made you see your own seat differently, just drop a single dot in the comments. Sometimes one small mark says, "I see it now, I've lived it, and I'm done staying quiet."